Almost right down in the middle of America is an area so sparsely populated that it makes people scratch their heads as to why. Most of the population of the United States is up against its cost. Why so few Americans live in this huge area in the middle of the country? Why is there a large belt down the middle that is almost entirely empty? The answer lies in some unique factors, and you're about to find out why. The west coast of the United States is famous for its wealth and big cities, but there's one part that's almost empty. Surprisingly, some people in this area have thought about separating from their states and forming their own state. Could this less crowded region actually become its own state? And how would it manage with so few people? The US is really big, with around 333 million people. But there are some weird things about where people live. Now, the big mystery is this empty part in southern Oregon and northern California. Up north, you have cities like Portland and Seattle, and down south, there's San Francisco, a major tech hub. But the space between these busy places is mostly empty. Why did this happen? Let's take a look into migrations, tough landscapes, and why people in this area wanted to be their own state before, and some still do. This part of the West Coast might become the 51st state in the United States. First, let's look at the overall population of the United States. About 40% of the people in the country live on or near the coast, even though these coastal areas make up only around 10% of the total land. That's roughly 128 million people living close to the oceans. So, it's kind of strange that a big part of the West Coast seems almost empty. Between 1970 and 2010, the population along the U.S. coasts increased by about 34.8 million people. Coastal counties in the United States generate more than $9.5 trillion in goods and services, providing jobs for 58.3 million people and paying $3.8 trillion in wages. If the West Coast were its own country, it would have the third largest GDP globally, after the U.S. as a whole and China. However, not much of this money or jobs can be found in the coastal regions of Northern California and Southern Oregon. Even though almost 130 million people live near the coast in the U.S., the population density in these specific areas is low compared to other coastal places. Climate change and rising sea levels are causing the U.S. landmass to shrink, particularly along the coasts. In 2020, the Western Coast region had around 484,727 people across 21,349 square miles. If it became its own state, it would have the smallest population in the nation, smaller than West Virginia, with much lower density than the national and coastal averages. Eugene, Oregon, the largest city in the region, has a population of 177,923, with a density of approximately 3,998 people per square mile. The broader Eugene metro area encompasses around 380,000 residents. Other population centers in the region include Medford, 223,000, Chico, 211,000, and Bend, 99,000. Despite its relatively modest population, Bend stands out as one of the top 10 fastest-growing cities in the United States. Established in 1905 along the Deschutes River, Bend began as a logging community. Evolving into a haven for outdoor enthusiasts interested in activities like fishing, hiking, skiing, and golfing, the town's population has grown steadily. With its appeal lying in a quieter lifestyle away from crowded urban areas, Bend attracts those seeking a closer connection to nature. This lifestyle isn't everyone's cup of tea, and that's one reason why there are so few people in this part of the West Coast. To understand what's happening in this region of the West Coast, let's look at national trends using census data from 2010 and 2020. In U.S. Census, rural areas have larger census blocks due to fewer people. In 2010, nearly 44% of these blocks were empty, making up about 47% of the country's land. While much of this is in Alaska, there's still a substantial amount in the continental U.S. The West Coast usually has higher population density, except for Northern California and Southern Oregon, with fewer people due to the impact of mountains on climate. Unlike empty farmland in the middle of the U.S., this region has its unique reasons for lower population. An interesting aspect from census data is that just because an area isn't considered residential doesn't mean people don't live there. For example, Central Park in New York City had recorded residents in census tracts. The question arises, why does this specific region have a much smaller population than the rest of the West Coast? The answer can be categorized into 4 factors: geography, navigability, infrastructure, and identity. Northern California and Southern Oregon's geography, encompassing expansive protected lands and challenging mountain ranges, hinders large-scale development. Regulations in protected areas slow settlement, preserving vibrant ecosystems with ancient trees. The imposing Cascades and the active volcano Mount Shasta make construction difficult, emphasizing the region's natural beauty. In Southern Oregon, Crater Lake, while scenic, adds to development challenges. These geographical features contribute to the area's sparse population and emphasize the delicate balance between preservation and growth. The Great Basin to the east, characterized by an arid climate and extreme biomes like Death Valley, limits the expansion of the coastal region. Rugged and rocky beaches make building ports or trade centers impractical, further contributing to the lower population in the region. Historical settlement patterns were influenced by navigability. The Oregon Trail guided settlers westward to Portland through the Columbia River. California's gold rush drew people, but the North lagged due to fewer significant events or accessible routes. Infrastructure development in the region was consequently delayed due to geographic challenges, limited accessibility, and a lack of major economic incentives. If the area had been more accessible and offered compelling reasons for settlement, it might not be as sparsely populated today. The sluggish population growth in Northern California and Southern Oregon is due to challenging geography and landscape unsuitable for large cities. The land, though rich in forest ecosystems, lacks fertility, except for the smaller Rogue Valley. Insufficient historical infrastructure development in Northern California and Southern Oregon hampers accessibility. Despite current technological capabilities, the region lags behind, necessitating substantial investments for transportation networks. The absence of strong incentives for relocation diminishes the likelihood of significant growth in both infrastructure and population. Residents in the sparsely populated regions of Northern California and Southern Oregon take pride in their unique heritage, shaped by rugged terrain and vast wilderness. They feel disconnected from densely populated cities, believing capitals and politicians are out of touch. This has led to conflicts as residents resist outside interference to maintain their way of life. The distinct identity of Northern California and Southern Oregon has fueled discussions of secession. The state of Jefferson, proposed in the mid-19th century and revived in the early 1940s, aimed to establish a new state independent of California and Oregon, citing a perceived lack of representation for rural communities. While there were various attempts and discussions over the years, the state of Jefferson has not materialized. Even in 2014, an advisory vote indicated support for forming their own state. But legal challenges and historical complexities have kept the idea from becoming a reality. The region's geography, limited infrastructure, and a cultural celebration of rural and wild nature contribute to its continued sparsity.